They used to call me the weak link, the one who couldn't tell a suspicious vehicle from a pizza delivery car, the woman who jumped at her own shadow and asked too many questions during meetings. For 3 years, I sat in the back corner of those monthly neighborhood watch gatherings, listening to my brother Marcus and his friends plan patrol routes and discuss security protocols like they were running some elite tactical operation instead of monitoring a sleepy suburban development in Willowbrook Heights. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you are subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I never spoke up when they assigned me to administrative duties, which basically meant bringing coffee and taking notes that nobody ever read. I never corrected them when they assumed I knew nothing about security systems, surveillance techniques, or threat assessment. And I definitely never mentioned why I moved to this quiet little town in the first place, or what I was really running from when I showed up at Marcus's doorstep 2 years ago with nothing but a duffel bag and a haunted look in my eyes. But last Tuesday night, everything changed. When Police Chief Henderson walked into our community center meeting, his face pale as winter snow, and said those 4 words that made my blood run cold: "We have a situation." I knew my carefully constructed new life was about to come crashing down around me. Because when he looked directly at me, straightened his shoulders and said, "General Foster, we need your expertise," the entire room went dead silent. And that's when I realized my biggest secret was about to become everyone else's reality. My name is Sarah Collins, at least that's what everyone in Willowbrook Heights knows me as. I moved here from somewhere I never talk about, to start over in a way I never explain. The house I rent sits at the end of Maple Street, a modest 2-bedroom with a garden I pretend to care about, and neighbors who wave politely but don't ask personal questions. Perfect for someone who needs to disappear. Marcus, my older brother, had been living here for 5 years when I arrived. He's one of those guys who takes community involvement seriously, the kind of person who organizes block parties and knows everyone's anniversary dates. When the Neighborhood Watch program started 3 years ago, he volunteered immediately and somehow convinced me to join, thinking it would help me integrate better with the community. The first meeting was held in the basement of St. Catherine's Community Center, a space that smelled like old coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. 12 residents showed up, mostly middle-aged homeowners concerned about a recent uptick in package thefts and vandalism. Marcus introduced me as his sister, the one who works from home doing freelance writing. Which wasn't entirely a lie. I do write, just not the kind of articles anyone in Willowbrook would want to read. The group's unofficial leader was Tom Bradley, a retired insurance adjuster who spoke with the authority of someone who'd watched too many police procedurals. His wife Janet took minutes in careful cursive handwriting, while Doug Martinelli contributed tactical insights gleaned from his weekend paintball league. These were good people, genuinely concerned about their community safety. But watching them debate the optimal angle for doorbell camera placement made me bite my tongue so hard I tasted blood. That first night, Tom handed out laminated cards with emergency contact numbers and a schedule for patrol shifts, which mostly involved driving slowly through the neighborhood between 7 and 9 p.m. When he asked if anyone had security experience, I stayed quiet while Doug mentioned his Army Reserve training from 15 years ago. They assigned me to communication coordination, which meant I was responsible for maintaining the group's phone tree and sending reminder emails about meetings. For months, this arrangement worked perfectly. I attended meetings, took notes, and watched these well-meaning amateurs try to protect a neighborhood that faced about as much danger as a retirement home library. The most exciting incident in our first year was when Mrs. Henderson's garden gnome went missing, which turned out to be a prank by her grandson. Tom treated it like a federal case, complete with a hand-drawn map of possible escape routes and a theory about organized gnome trafficking. I learned to nod at appropriate moments during Tom's presentations about perimeter security and civilian patrol protocols. I mastered the art of looking interested when Janet read detailed reports about suspicious joggers and unfamiliar delivery trucks. Most importantly, I perfected the skill of being completely invisible, just another suburban woman who brought homemade cookies to meetings and worried about property values. But invisibility is harder to maintain than people think. It requires constant attention to detail, careful management of personal information, and the discipline to never slip into old habits. After 18 months in Willowbrook, I'd almost convinced myself that General Catherine Foster was truly dead and buried, that Sarah Collins was my real identity now. The first crack in that illusion came during our February meeting last year. Tom was explaining his new theory about the correlation between street light placement and crime prevention when the lights went out, not just in the community center, but throughout the entire neighborhood. Through the basement windows, we could see the power grid failing block by block, leaving Willowbrook Heights in complete darkness. While Tom fumbled for his phone's flashlight and Janet worried about frozen pipes, I found myself automatically assessing the situation with a clarity that cut through the civilian panic like a blade. 17 minutes past 8 p.m., temperatures dropping towards freezing, no backup power systems in the community center, 12 individuals ranging from age 45 to 73, most with underlying health conditions that could be affected by temperature extremes. My hands moved without conscious thought, organizing people away from the windows, establishing a central gathering point near the emergency exit, mentally cataloging available resources and potential security vulnerabilities. When Mrs. Patterson started hyperventilating, I guided her through breathing exercises that I'd learned in a very different context during very different kinds of emergencies. "Sarah, how did you know to do that?" Marcus asked me quietly while I helped Mrs. Patterson get settled with a cup of water from Janet's emergency kit. I gave him the same smile that I'd perfected over months of practice. "I took a first aid class once." But I could see the question in his eyes, the same question that flickered across Tom's face when he noticed how quickly I'd taken charge of the situation. For 26 minutes, while we waited for power to be restored, I'd stopped being invisible. I'd become competent, decisive, and just a little too comfortable with crisis management. The power came back on before anyone could ask follow-up questions, and I made sure to resume my usual position in the background. Tom thanked everyone for staying calm during the emergency and scheduled an extra meeting to discuss power outage protocols. I volunteered to research emergency preparedness guidelines online, which gave me a legitimate reason to know more than a freelance writer probably should about disaster response procedures. Over the following months, I worked harder at being forgettable. I asked basic questions about security camera specifications that I could have answered in my sleep. I deferred to Doug's tactical knowledge even when his suggestions violated fundamental principles of surveillance and perimeter defense. I perfected the art of looking confused when Tom used military terminology incorrectly, even though every misused phrase made me want to deliver an impromptu lecture on proper operational language. The hardest part wasn't hiding my knowledge, it was suppressing my instincts. When new families moved into the neighborhood, I had to resist the urge to conduct informal background assessments. When Tom proposed patrol routes that left obvious blind spots, I bit my tongue instead of sketching more effective alternatives. When the group discussed installing a neighborhood security system, I stayed silent, even though I could have designed something 10 times more sophisticated using equipment they could buy at any electronics store. But instincts don't disappear just because you change your name and move to suburbia. They lurk beneath the surface, waiting for the right trigger to bring them roaring back to life. Mine stayed buried until last month, when Sarah Martinez joined our group. Sarah was new to Willowbrook, a single mother who'd moved here after her divorce, looking for a safe place to raise her 8-year-old daughter. She seemed normal enough during her first meeting, asking appropriate questions about patrol schedules and community resources, but something about her felt wrong in a way that I couldn't articulate, like a photograph that looks perfect until you notice the shadows are falling in the wrong direction. She volunteered for patrol duty immediately, which Tom appreciated since we were always short-handed. She asked intelligent questions about communication protocols and emergency procedures. She even brought excellent coffee to the next meeting, earning immediate points with Janet and Mrs. Patterson. On the surface, Sarah Martinez was exactly the kind of engaged community member our group needed. But I started watching her. Not obviously, not in any way that would attract attention, but with the focused observation skills that some people spend decades learning and others are forced to develop much faster. I noticed how her eyes cataloged exit routes during her first meeting. I saw how she positioned herself with clear sight lines to both entrances. Most telling of all, I caught the micro-expression that flickered across her face when Tom mentioned our neighborhood's proximity to the interstate, a look of calculation that lasted less than a second but spoke volumes to someone trained to read facial tells. For 3 weeks, I gathered information. Sarah Martinez had moved here from Phoenix, worked as a dental hygienist, and rented a house on Oak Street with excellent views of both the main neighborhood entrance and the walking trail that connected to the larger park system. Her daughter Emma was enrolled at Willowbrook Elementary and seemed like a normal, happy kid. Her divorce had been finalized 6 months ago, and her ex-husband had no known criminal record. Everything checked out perfectly, which is exactly what worried me. I started taking different routes during my daily walks, routes that happened to pass by Oak Street around the times when normal people would be leaving for work or
Sarah asked exactly the right questions about installation timeline and lighting specifications, but she asked them in exactly the wrong way, with the casual precision of someone who understood tactical illumination principles. That night, I went home and did something Sarah Collins would never do, but General Foster couldn't avoid. I ran a proper background check. Sarah Martinez existed, just like her documentation claimed, but her digital footprint was suspiciously clean, the kind of online presence that looked authentic until you realized it had been constructed rather than accumulated. Her social media accounts showed appropriate suburban mother content going back 18 months, but nothing before that. Her employment history included the right credentials and references, but when I dug deeper into the dental practice in Phoenix, I found irregularities that suggested the records had been enhanced. Most damning of all, her financial profile showed payment patterns consistent with someone receiving regular income from sources that weren't reflected in her official employment records. I spent 2 weeks debating what to do with this information. Sarah Collins would have convinced herself that she was being paranoid, that a perfectly innocent woman was being scrutinized unfairly by someone whose judgment had been warped by past experiences. But General Catherine Foster knew the difference between paranoia and pattern recognition, and every pattern pointed toward the same conclusion. Sarah Martinez wasn't just new to Willowbrook Heights. She was working for someone, gathering intelligence about our community for reasons that had nothing to do with neighborhood safety. The question was whether she represented a threat to be managed or eliminated. That question got answered last Tuesday night when Chief Henderson walked into our monthly meeting looking like he'd seen a ghost, and everything I'd built here started falling apart. Because sometimes your past doesn't just catch up with you. Sometimes it kicks down the door, looks you straight in the eye, and demands that you choose between the life you've been living and the person you really are. And sometimes, when people's lives are on the line, there really isn't a choice at all. Chief Henderson stood in the doorway of our community center basement, like a man carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. His uniform was wrinkled, his normally perfectly groomed mustache slightly disheveled, and his hands trembled just enough to make the room's fluorescent lights catch the sweat on his palms. In 15 years of leading Willowbrook Heights Police Department, I'd never seen him look anything less than completely in control. Tom Bradley was mid-sentence explaining his latest theory about coordinated surveillance between dog walkers when Henderson's presence registered. The room fell quiet with that particular silence that comes when authority enters a space where it's not expected. Janet's pen stopped moving across her notebook. Doug straightened in his folding chair. Marcus looked between the chief and me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Henderson's eyes swept the room methodically, cataloging faces until they settled on mine. Something passed between us in that moment, a recognition that went deeper than civilian pleasantries. He knew. Somehow, after 2 years of carefully maintained anonymity, Chief Henderson knew exactly who Sarah Collins really was. "Evening, folks," he said, his voice carrying none of its usual small-town warmth. "Sorry to interrupt your meeting, but we've got a developing situation that requires immediate community coordination." "Of course, Chief. What kind of situation are we looking at?" Henderson pulled out a tablet, its screen displaying what looked like surveillance footage. 3 hours ago, federal agencies began monitoring unusual activity in this area. We have reason to believe Willowbrook Heights is being surveilled by individuals with potential ties to domestic terrorism operations. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mrs. Patterson's hand flew to her chest. Janet's notebook slipped from her fingers and hit the linoleum floor with a sound like a gunshot. Doug leaned forward so far he nearly fell off his chair. But I felt something entirely different. the familiar cold clarity that comes when training kicks in and civilian emotions get pushed aside. My mind automatically began processing threat assessment protocols while my hands remained perfectly still in my lap. Because General Catherine Foster had heard briefings like this before, in rooms much more secured than a church basement, about threats much more serious than domestic surveillance. "What kind of surveillance?" Tom asked, his voice higher than usual. Henderson touched the tablet screen and the image shifted to show thermal signatures moving through what I recognized as the wooded area behind Willowbrook Elementary School. Organized reconnaissance. Professional-level equipment. At least 4 individuals conducting systematic intelligence gathering about neighborhood patterns, security weaknesses, and high-value targets. High-value targets. The phrase hit me like cold water because it meant this wasn't random. Someone had identified specific objectives within our community, which meant someone had done their homework about who lived here and why they might be worth targeting. "Chief," I heard myself say, my voice steady despite the growing certainty that my past had finally caught up with me. "Do you have any indication of what they're looking for?" Henderson's eyes locked onto mine with laser focus. That's what we're hoping to determine. But given the sophistication of their operation, we're treating this as a credible threat to community safety. Tom practically vibrated with excitement. This was the moment he'd been preparing for since the Neighborhood Watch program began, the validation of every laminated protocol sheet and emergency contact tree he'd created. "Of course, Chief. What kind of situation are we looking at?" Henderson pulled out a tablet, its screen displaying what looked like surveillance footage. 3 hours ago, federal agencies began monitoring unusual activity in this area. We have reason to believe Willowbrook Heights is being surveilled by individuals with potential ties to domestic terrorism operations. Tom was fumbling with his laminated emergency protocols, flipping through pages like they contained the solution to international espionage. "Actually," Henderson said slowly, never breaking eye contact with me, "I think we need to approach this differently. Sometimes, the best defense comes from understanding your enemy's objectives, and sometimes that requires expertise beyond standard civilian protocols." The silence stretched long enough for everyone to notice. Marcus was staring at me now with an expression I'd never seen before, like he was looking at a stranger wearing his sister's face. Janet picked up her notebook but didn't resume writing. Doug's paintball tactical knowledge suddenly seemed as relevant as a children's board game. Henderson moved closer to where I sat, his boots echoing against the concrete floor. "Sarah, I wonder if you might have some insights that could help us understand what we're dealing with." It was a question disguised as a request, but really it was an invitation to step out of hiding. After 2 years of carefully maintained anonymity, of letting Tom Bradley lead discussions about security while I sat in the background pretending ignorance, Chief Henderson was offering me a choice: stay hidden and let other people handle a situation they weren't equipped for, or reveal the truth and deal with the consequences. I looked around the room at these people I'd grown to care about despite myself. Tom with his earnest dedication to protecting neighbors he'd known for decades. Janet, who remembered everyone's birthdays and organized meal trains when people were sick. Mrs. Patterson, who brought her late husband's military decorations to Memorial Day ceremonies and cried every single year. Doug, who might not know real tactics but would risk his life for any of us without hesitation. They deserved better than amateur hour when professionals were targeting their community. "What kind of insights are you looking for?" I asked carefully. Henderson set his tablet on the folding table next to Janet's forgotten notebook. The thermal images showed movement patterns that were definitely not random, coordination that spoke of training and experience. The kind that come from understanding how these operations actually work. From someone who might recognize tactical approaches that civilian law enforcement doesn't encounter very often. Tom looked confused. "Sarah's a freelance writer. I mean, she's great at research and organization, but I don't think she has experience with surveillance operations." "Actually," Henderson said, gently but firmly, "I think Sarah has considerably more experience than any of us realized." Marcus leaned back in his chair like he'd been hit. "What are you talking about?" Henderson reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a folder, the kind with official government seals that civilians rarely see.
Sarah asked exactly the right questions about installation timeline and lighting specifications, but she asked them in exactly the wrong way, with the casual precision of someone who understood tactical illumination principles. That night, I went home and did something Sarah Collins would never do,
but General Foster couldn't avoid. I ran a proper background check. Sarah Martinez existed, just like her documentation claimed, but her digital footprint was suspiciously clean, the kind of online presence that looked authentic until you realized it had been constructed rather than accumulated. Her social media accounts showed appropriate suburban mother content going back 18 months, but nothing before that. Her employment history included the right credentials and references, but when I dug deeper into the dental practice in Phoenix, I found irregularities that suggested the records had been enhanced. Most damning of all, her financial profile showed payment patterns consistent with someone receiving regular income from sources that weren't reflected in her official employment records. I spent 2 weeks debating what to do with this information. Sarah Collins would have convinced herself that she was being paranoid, that a perfectly innocent woman was being scrutinized unfairly by someone whose judgment had been warped by past experiences. But General Catherine Foster knew the difference between paranoia and pattern recognition, and every pattern pointed toward the same conclusion. Sarah Martinez wasn't just new to Willowbrook Heights. She was working for someone, gathering intelligence about our community for reasons that had nothing to do with neighborhood safety. The question was whether she represented a threat to be managed or eliminated. That question got answered last Tuesday night, when Chief Henderson walked into our monthly meeting looking like he'd seen a ghost, and everything I had built here started falling apart. Because sometimes your past doesn't just catch up with you. Sometimes it kicks down the door, looks you straight in the eye, and demands that you choose between the life you've been living and the person you really are. And sometimes, when people's lives are on the line, there really isn't a choice at all. Chief Henderson stood in the doorway of our community center basement like a man carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. His uniform was wrinkled, his normally perfectly groomed mustache slightly disheveled, and his hands trembled just enough to make the room's fluorescent lights catch the sweat on his palms. In 15 years of leading Willowbrook Heights Police Department, I'd never seen him look anything less than completely in control. Tom Bradley was mid-sentence explaining his latest theory about coordinated surveillance between dog walkers when Henderson's presence registered. The room fell quiet, with that particular silence that comes when authority enters a space where it's not expected. Janet's pen stopped moving across her notebook. Doug straightened in his folding chair. Marcus looked between the chief and me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Henderson's eyes swept the room methodically, cataloging faces until they settled on mine. Something passed between us in that moment, a recognition that went deeper than civilian pleasantries. He knew. Somehow, after 2 years of carefully maintained anonymity, Chief Henderson knew exactly who Sarah Collins really was. "Evening, folks," he said, his voice carrying none of its usual small-town warmth. "Sorry to interrupt your meeting, but we've got a developing situation that requires immediate community coordination." "Of course, Chief. What kind of situation are we looking at?" Henderson pulled out a tablet, its screen displaying what looked like surveillance footage. 3 hours ago, federal agencies began monitoring unusual activity in this area. We have reason to believe Willowbrook Heights is being surveilled by individuals with potential ties to domestic terrorism operations. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mrs. Patterson's hand flew to her chest. Janet's notebook slipped from her fingers and hit the linoleum floor with a sound like a gunshot. Doug leaned forward so far he nearly fell off his chair. But I felt something entirely different. The familiar cold clarity that comes when training kicks in and civilian emotions get pushed aside. My mind automatically began processing threat assessment protocols, while my hands remained perfectly still in my lap. Because General Catherine Foster had heard briefings like this before, in rooms much more secure than a church basement, about threats much more serious than domestic surveillance. "What kind of surveillance?" Tom asked, his voice higher than usual. Henderson touched the tablet screen, and the image shifted to show thermal signatures moving through what I recognized as the wooded area behind Willowbrook Elementary School. Organized reconnaissance, professional-level equipment, At least 4 individuals conducting systematic intelligence gathering about neighborhood patterns, security weaknesses, and high-value targets. High-value targets. The phrase hit me like cold water, because it meant this wasn't random. Someone had identified specific objectives within our community, which meant someone had done their homework about who lived here and why they might be worth targeting. "Chief," I heard myself say, my voice steady despite the growing certainty that my past had finally caught up with me. "Do you have any indication of what they're looking for?" Henderson's eyes locked onto mine with laser focus. "That's what we're hoping to determine. But, given the sophistication of their operation, we're treating this as a credible threat to community safety." Tom practically vibrated with excitement. This was the moment he'd been preparing for since the Neighborhood Watch program began, the validation of every laminated protocol sheet and emergency contact tree he'd created. "Of course, Chief. What kind of situation are we looking at?" Henderson pulled out a tablet, something that looked like surveillance footage.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah Collins moved to Willowbrook Heights 26 months ago from an address that doesn't exist, with employment records that trace back to companies that were dissolved the week after she arrived. Her background check came back clean because someone with significant federal authority made sure it would. My heart was hammering, but my training kept my expression neutral. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," Henderson said. "I'm stating that the woman sitting in this room is not Sarah Collins, and given the nature of the threat we're currently facing, I believe we need General Catherine Foster's expertise to keep this community safe." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Tom's mouth opened and closed without sound. Janet's pen snapped in her grip. Marcus stared at me like I'd grown a second head, and Mrs. Patterson made a small noise that might have been surprise or fear. I could have denied it, could have maintained the fiction for a few more minutes, maybe even convinced them that Henderson was confused or mistaken, but the thermal images on his tablet showed professional-level surveillance of people I cared about, and General Foster had never been able to ignore threats to innocent civilians. "How long have you known?" I asked quietly. 6 months. Henderson admitted. "Homeland Security ran facial recognition software during a routine traffic safety audit. Your photo was flagged, but when I requested your file, I was told to monitor and protect without making contact unless circumstances required it." "What circumstances would require contact?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Henderson gestured toward the tablet, "The kind we're facing right now. Because whoever is surveilling this neighborhood isn't here for the hardware store or the elementary school. They're here for someone specific, and based on the areas they're focusing on, that someone lives on Maple Street. My address. They were targeting my house, which meant they knew exactly who Sarah Collins really was. After 2 years of careful anonymity, someone had connected the dots and decided that General Catherine Foster represented either an asset worth acquiring or a threat worth eliminating. "I need to see those thermal images," I said, dropping the pretense completely. Henderson slid the tablet across the table. The moment I touched the screen, muscle memory took over. My fingers moved through the surveillance data with the fluency of someone who'd spent years analyzing intelligence reports, identifying patterns that civilian training wouldn't recognize. The reconnaissance team was good, but they weren't invisible. 4 operatives, probably ex-military based on their movement discipline. They'd established overwatch positions covering all approaches to my house and the elementary school where little Emma Martinez walked every day. Their equipment signatures suggested night vision capabilities and long-range communication systems. Most concerning of all, they'd been in position for at least 72 hours, which meant this wasn't a probing operation. "This is a capture mission," I said, the words coming out with clinical precision. 4-person team, extended surveillance period, multiple overwatch positions. They're gathering intelligence for a planned extraction operation. "Extraction of what?" Tom asked. I looked up from the tablet to find everyone staring at me. Not Sarah Collins, who brought cookies to meetings and asked basic questions about security cameras. General Catherine Foster, who could read tactical situations like other people read newspapers, who understood exactly what kind of danger was moving through their peaceful neighborhood. "Me,"
I said simply. The confession seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Marcus leaned forward, his face pale. "Katie, what the hell is going on?" It was the first time he'd called me by my real name in 2 years, and hearing it spoken aloud felt like stepping out of a costume I'd worn so long I'd almost forgotten it wasn't my real skin. "It's complicated," I began, but Henderson interrupted. "General Foster was involved in classified operations that resulted in the disruption of several high-value criminal networks. When her identity was compromised, she was relocated under federal protection while the threats were assessed and neutralized." "Were they neutralized?" Doug asked. Henderson and I exchanged glances. "Some of them," he said carefully. "Which means others are still active," I continued, "and apparently they found me." Janet finally found her voice. "You're really a general? Like an actual military general?" "Army intelligence, specialized in counterterrorism operations. I spent 12 years identifying and dismantling networks that targeted American citizens. Some of those networks had significant resources and long memories." Mrs. Patterson was shaking her head slowly. "All this time, you've been letting Tom explain security procedures to you like you'd never heard them before." "Tom's heart is in the right place," I said, glancing at our self-appointed security coordinator, who looked like he was questioning everything he'd ever believed. "Community policing and military operations serve different purposes. What works for neighborhood safety doesn't necessarily translate to counterintelligence." "But you could have helped us," Marcus said, hurt evident in his voice. "All those meetings where we struggled with basic security questions, and you just sat there pretending you didn't know anything?" "I was protecting you," I replied. "The best way to keep everyone safe was to make sure my presence here looked completely normal, just another suburban woman worried about package thieves and property values." Henderson pulled up another screen on his tablet. "Unfortunately, that cover has been compromised. The surveillance team arrived Sunday night, which means someone with access to federal relocation records identified your current location." The implications hit me like a physical blow. If someone had accessed my relocation file, they knew not just where I was, but potentially why I'd been moved. They understood the nature of the threats that had necessitated my disappearance, and they'd decided those threats were worth exploiting. "Who knows about this surveillance?" I asked Henderson. "State police are briefed. FBI is sending a team from the regional office, but given the timeline, we're looking at 12 to 18 hours before significant federal resources arrive." "That's too long," I said, studying the movement patterns on the thermal display. "This team isn't planning to wait for reinforcements. Based on their positioning and the equipment signatures, they're preparing for immediate action." Tom was fumbling through his emergency protocols again, searching for procedures that didn't exist. "What should we do? Should we evacuate the neighborhood? Call in the National Guard?" "Evacuation would trigger their operation immediately. They're waiting for something, probably optimal conditions for extraction with minimal civilian exposure. Moving everyone out would eliminate their biggest constraint." "So we're supposed to just sit here and wait?" Doug asked. I looked around the room at these good people who'd been thrust into a situation they never could have prepared for. Tom with his laminated protocols that covered lost pets and noise complaints, but not federal fugitive operations. Janet with her careful meeting minutes that documented discussions about streetlight placement instead of tactical assessments. Marcus, who'd invited his sister to join Neighborhood Watch, thinking it would help her make friends, never imagining he was harboring a former general with a target on her back. They deserved honesty, even if the truth was more dangerous than the comfortable fiction we'd all been living. "There's something else you need to know," I said, my voice steady despite the weight of what I was about to reveal. "The surveillance team isn't the only threat we're dealing with." Henderson raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Sarah Martinez," I said, watching as recognition flickered across several faces. "The new member who joined our group last month? She's not a divorced dental hygienist from Phoenix." Tom looked genuinely confused. "Sarah? But she brings excellent coffee, and she's been very helpful with patrol scheduling. She's also been conducting systematic intelligence gathering about our group's activities, neighborhood security measures, and resident patterns," I continued. "Her background is fabricated, Her employment history is enhanced, and her daily behavior suggests training in surveillance and infiltration techniques. Marcus was staring at me like I'd announced aliens were invading. You think Sarah Martinez is some kind of spy? I think Sarah Martinez is advanced reconnaissance for whatever operation is being planned against me, I replied. The external surveillance team provides overwatch and extraction capability. Martinez provides inside intelligence and potentially direct access to our neighborhood's security protocols. Henderson was already reaching for his radio. We need to locate Martinez immediately. She's not at her house, I said, checking my watch. Tuesday nights she takes Emma to gymnastics at the community center on 5th Street. They should be there for another 40 minutes. How do you know that? Janet asked. Because I've been watching her the same way she's been watching us, I admitted. The difference is that I know what professional surveillance looks like, and I know what questions to ask when someone's background doesn't quite add up. Doug leaned forward. So what's the plan? Do we confront her? Arrest her? We don't do anything, I said firmly. This situation requires federal coordination and professional handling. The best thing this group can do is maintain normal routines while law enforcement manages the threat. Like hell, Marcus said, his voice carrying an edge I'd rarely heard. You're my sister. I'm not sitting on the sidelines while people target our neighborhood. Marcus, these aren't package thieves or vandals. I tried to explain. These are professionally trained operatives with significant resources and no concern for civilian casualties. The neighborhood watch protocols you've learned don't apply to this kind of threat. Then teach us the ones that do, Tom said quietly. I looked at him in surprise. Our earnest, protocol-obsessed security coordinator was staring at me with determined focus, his laminated emergency procedures forgotten on the table beside him. Tom, this isn't community policing. This is counterintelligence operations with potential for significant violence. This is our neighborhood. These are our families and our homes. I don't care if you're a general or a grocery clerk. You're part of this community, and we don't abandon our people. Janet nodded firmly. Tom's right. We might not have your training, but we know every street, every house, every hiding place in Willowbrook Heights. That has to count for something. Mrs. Patterson stood up with more determination than I'd seen from her in 2 years of meetings. My Harold served 3 tours in Vietnam, and he used to say that local knowledge beats military training when you're fighting on home ground. Henderson was watching this exchange with interest. General, what's your assessment of community involvement in defensive operations? It was a fair question, and one that required an honest answer. These people were already targets simply by association with me. Martinez had been gathering intelligence about the neighborhood watch group specifically, which meant civilian involvement wasn't optional anymore. The question was whether that involvement would be coordinated or chaotic. If we're going to do this, I said slowly, then we do it right. No improvisation, no heroics, and absolutely no deviation from whatever plan we establish. These people are professionals, and they will exploit any weakness or uncertainty we show them. Does that mean you'll train us? Doug asked. I looked around the room one more time, at faces that had become familiar over months of meetings about streetlight placement and patrol schedules. Tom, who took community safety more seriously than anyone I'd ever met. Janet, who remembered every detail and asked exactly the right questions. Mrs. Patterson, who'd survived 73 years, including the loss of her husband, and still showed up to every meeting ready to help. Marcus, who'd given me a place to disappear and never asked questions about why I needed to vanish. They weren't soldiers, but they were neighbors. And sometimes neighbors were all you had. Henderson, how long do we have before the FBI team arrives? 16 hours minimum, possibly longer depending on federal coordination. And how long before the surveillance team moves to active operations? Unknown, but based on their current positioning, they could initiate extraction within 6 hours if conditions are favorable. I made a decision that General Foster would understand, even if Sarah Collins might have questioned it. All right, I said, standing up for the first time since Henderson had entered the room. If we're going to protect this neighborhood, then everyone needs to understand exactly what we're dealing with and exactly what's expected of them. Henderson nodded approvingly. What do you need? First, I need Martinez contained without alerting the external surveillance team. Can your department handle that quietly? Consider it done. Second, I need complete neighborhood maps including utility access, storm drains, and any underground infrastructure. Tom, do you have those in your emergency planning materials?
Tom was already reaching for his file cabinet. Everything from the city planning office plus some blueprints Doug's construction company provided. Third, I need communication equipment that can't be monitored by standard surveillance gear. Henderson, can state police provide encrypted radios? I'll make the calls. And finally, I said, looking directly at Marcus, I need everyone to understand that what we're planning is dangerous, illegal in several different ways, and could result in serious injury or death. Anyone who wants to walk away needs to do it now, and there won't be any judgment or hard feelings. Nobody moved. Not Tom with his dedication to community safety, not Janet with her careful attention to detail, not Mrs. Patterson with her late husband's military pride, not Doug with his weekend warrior enthusiasm, and definitely not Marcus, who was looking at me with a mixture of pride and terror that made my chest tight. All right then, I said, feeling General Catherine Foster fully emerge for the first time in 2 years. Let's talk about how to defend Willowbrook Heights. The transformation from Suburban Book Club to Tactical Operations Center took exactly 47 minutes. By the time Henderson returned with encrypted radios and confirmation that Sarah Martinez was in federal custody, the basement of St. Catherine's Community Center had become something I'd never thought I'd see again, a proper command post. Tom had spread his neighborhood maps across 3 folding tables, weighted down with coffee mugs and marked with colored pens showing sight lines, vehicle access points, and potential defensive positions. Janet had abandoned her meeting minutes in favor of detailed logistics lists, tracking everything from resident locations to available resources with the precision of a military quartermaster. Mrs. Patterson was testing radio frequencies with the focused intensity of someone who'd spent decades as a Navy wife, while Doug sketched defensive positions with surprising accuracy for someone whose tactical experience came from weekend paintball games. But it was Marcus who surprised me most. My brother, who'd never shown interest in anything more complex than community barbecue organization, was studying building blueprints with the methodical attention of someone born for strategic planning. When he looked up and caught me watching him, I saw something in his expression that made me realize I'd been underestimating more than just myself these past 2 years. The storm drain system connects to the old municipal tunnels, he said, pointing to lines on the blueprint that I'd missed completely. They built them in the 60s when they thought Willowbrook might become a major suburb. Never happened, but the infrastructure's still there. How do you know that? I asked. Because I've been the unofficial neighborhood historian for 5 years. Someone has to keep track of which utility lines go where and which contractors did shoddy work that might cause problems later. You think I organize block parties just for fun? Henderson appeared at my shoulder, studying Marcus's annotations. Those tunnels could provide concealed movement throughout the neighborhood. Do you have access points mapped? 6 confirmed entrances, probably 3 more that are overgrown but still functional, Marcus confirmed. Storm drain behind the elementary school connects directly to the main junction under Oak Street. From there, you can reach any house in the development without surface exposure. I stared at my brother with new respect. Marcus, how long have you been thinking like a tactical planner? Since about 20 minutes after you moved here, and I realized my sister was running from something serious enough to make her change her entire identity, he said calmly. I might not be a general, but I'm not stupid. When someone with your skill set shows up pretending to be helpless, you start paying attention to things that might matter if trouble follows her home. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Marcus had known. Not the specifics, maybe not the military background or the federal protection status, but he'd recognized that Sarah Collins was a fiction designed to hide someone much more dangerous. Why didn't you say anything? I asked. Because you needed time to heal from whatever put you here, he replied simply. And because I figured if you were hiding, you probably had good reasons.
My job was to make sure you had a safe place to do it." Janet looked up from her logistics notes. "How many of us knew something was different about Sarah?" Mrs. Patterson raised her hand without hesitation. "Harold used to say you could always spot military training by how someone carries themselves. Sarah moved like someone who'd learned to be ready for anything, even when she was pretending to be confused by security camera specifications." Doug nodded agreement. "Plus, you asked questions that were too basic, like you were performing ignorance instead of actually being ignorant. Someone who really didn't know anything about security wouldn't ask about optimal camera angles, they'd ask why cameras were necessary at all." Henderson was studying me with the expression of someone reassessing everything he thought he knew. "The night the power went out, you organized our response like you'd done it before. Not just first aid training, actual emergency management. I've been wondering about that for months." I looked around the room at these people I'd thought I was protecting by maintaining my cover, only to discover that my cover had been transparent to anyone paying attention. The realization was simultaneously humbling and oddly comforting. They'd known I was hiding something significant, and they'd chosen to protect that secret without even knowing what it was. "So what now?" I asked Henderson. "Martinez is contained, but the external surveillance team is still active. How do we proceed?" Henderson consulted his tablet, now displaying real-time updates from state police coordination with federal agencies. "FBI tactical team is en route, but still 12 hours out. State police can provide perimeter support, but not direct engagement with professionally trained operatives. For the next several hours, we are essentially on our own." "Define on our own," Doug said. "Legally, I cannot authorize civilian involvement in active law enforcement operations. However, as police chief, I have broad discretion in coordinating community safety measures during emergency situations." Translation: you can't officially ask us to help, but you can't officially stop us from defending our own neighborhood. "That's a fairly accurate assessment," Henderson agreed. I studied the maps and radio equipment, considering options that ranged from purely defensive to actively aggressive. The surveillance team had positioned themselves for extraction, which meant they believed they could complete their mission and withdraw before effective resistance could be organized. Their mistake was assuming that effective resistance required federal resources. "Here's what we're going to do," I announced, feeling the familiar clarity that came with operational planning. "We're going to make this neighborhood the most difficult extraction target they've ever encountered, and we're going to do it using every advantage we have over outside operators." "Which advantages are those?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "Local knowledge, community coordination, and the element of surprise. They've planned this operation based on surveillance of a quiet suburban development defended by amateur neighborhood watch protocols. They're not prepared for coordinated resistance led by someone with professional tactical training." Marcus leaned over the maps. "What kind of coordination are we talking about?" "Henderson, do your encrypted radios have enough range to cover the entire neighborhood?" 2-mile radius, which should be more than sufficient."
Perfect. Tom, I need your patrol schedule modified to provide continuous overwatch of all access points without appearing to deviate from normal patterns. Can you reorganize the routes?" Tom was already sketching revised patrol paths. If we extend the evening patrol to include the walking trail behind the school and add a late-night circuit around the park, we can maintain visual contact with their primary observation posts. "Janet, we need supply coordination, emergency medical supplies, communication backup, and evacuation resources for any civilians who might be caught in crossfire." Janet's pen was flying across her notebook. "The church has a first aid station in the main hall, plus emergency supplies stored for disaster relief. Mrs. Henderson runs the Red Cross volunteer program, so she'd have access to additional medical resources." "Mrs. Patterson, how much do you remember about military communication protocols?" The elderly woman straightened in her chair. "Enough to coordinate radio traffic and maintain operational security. Harold spent 30 years teaching communications to new recruits, and some of that rubbed off." "Doug, I need engineering assessment of defensive positions. These aren't paintball opponents, so we need real cover and concealment options." Doug was already circling locations on the neighborhood map. "The community center has good sight lines and multiple exit routes. Thompson's garage on 3rd Street has concrete block construction that would stop small arms fire, and the old utility building behind the park has underground access through the storm drain system. Henderson was monitoring updates on his tablet while listening to our planning session. I have to ask, General, what exactly are you planning? Because if this moves beyond defensive measures, I need to know about it. What I'm planning, I said carefully, is to make their extraction mission impossible to complete successfully. Professional operators work within calculated risk parameters. If we can demonstrate that their mission parameters are no longer valid, they'll abort and withdraw. And if they don't withdraw? Marcus asked. Then we make sure they understand that Willowbrook Heights is defended by people who won't be intimidated, extracted, or eliminated without a fight. Tom looked up from his revised patrol schedules. You're talking about actual combat operations. I'm talking about protecting our community using whatever resources are available, I corrected. If that includes combat operations, then we make sure we're prepared for them. Henderson received an alert on his tablet that made him frown. We may not have as much time as we thought. State police intercepted communications suggesting the surveillance team is preparing to move to active operations within the next 4 hours. What changed their timeline? I asked. Martinez's detention. They probably have protocols for communication checks, and when she fails to report in, they'll assume their cover is blown. The room went quiet as everyone processed what that meant. We'd moved from theoretical planning to immediate operational necessity. Whatever we were going to do, we needed to do it soon. All right, I said, standing up and feeling the last vestiges of Sarah Collins disappear completely. This is your last chance to walk away. Once we commit to defending this neighborhood, we're committed completely. There's no changing your mind once operations begin. Nobody moved. Tom was organizing his patrol protocols. Janet was finalizing supply lists. Mrs. Patterson was testing radio frequencies. Doug was calculating sight lines and defensive angles. Marcus was studying tunnel access points with the focus of someone preparing for war. Henderson, I need one more thing, I said. Official recognition that this community is preparing to defend itself against hostile action with police department coordination and support. Henderson stood at attention, his bearing suddenly formal and military precise. General Foster, as police chief of Willowbrook Heights, I hereby request your assistance in coordinating community defense operations against verified threats to civilian safety. The formality of his words carried weight beyond their literal meaning. He was officially recognizing my authority and expertise, asking for professional consultation rather than amateur assistance. More importantly, he was using my real name and rank in front of people who'd known me as something completely different. Request acknowledged, Chief Henderson. I accept responsibility for tactical coordination of defensive operations with full community support and police department liaison. Tom looked between Henderson and me with an expression of dawning understanding. You're really doing this. You're really a general. I really am. And for the next several hours, this neighborhood is under my operational command. Anyone who can't accept that authority should leave now. Tom straightened his shoulders and gave me something that was almost a salute. General Foster, the Willowbrook Heights Neighborhood Watch is ready to receive orders. Janet stood and nodded formally. Logistics support is prepared and available. Mrs. Patterson adjusted the radio headset she'd been testing. Communications are operational and standing by. Doug rolled up his defensive position sketches. Engineering assessment is complete and ready for implementation. Marcus looked at me with a pride I hadn't seen since we were children. Local knowledge and tunnel access are at your disposal. Henderson clipped his radio to his belt and checked his service weapon. Police coordination is established and ready to proceed. I looked around the room at 6 people who'd transformed from amateur neighborhood watch volunteers into something resembling a functional tactical team. They weren't soldiers, but they were neighbors defending their homes, and that carried its own kind of strength. First priority is establishing communication and overwatch. Tom, I want your patrol teams repositioned to provide early warning of any movement toward residential areas. Janet, coordinate with Mrs. Henderson to establish medical support at the community center. Mrs. Patterson, maintain radio contact with all teams and monitor police frequencies for federal updates. What about direct engagement protocols? Doug asked.
We avoid direct engagement unless civilians are threatened or extraction is attempted. Our objective is deterrence and delay, not elimination. Professional operators respect superior tactical position, and that's what we're going to demonstrate.
They're avoiding the main streets, using exactly the concealment routes we predicted. Doug was right about those sightlines. Henderson's voice joined the communication net from his coordination point at the community center. Federal air support is 20 minutes out. Can we maintain defensive posture until arrival? Negative, I replied, watching thermal readings on the tablet Henderson had provided. They're moving directly toward residential areas. We need to intercept before they reach civilian homes. The surveillance team had made their first tactical error by underestimating local knowledge. They were approaching through what looked like optimal concealment, following the wooded path behind the elementary school that would provide cover until they reached the housing development. What they didn't know was that Marcus had spent 5 years mapping every drainage culvert, utility access, and maintenance pathway in that area. Marcus, are you in position at junction point 3? Affirmative, Katie. I can see them through the storm drain grating. They're using military hand signals, definitely professional training. Janet, medical station status. Ready and staffed. Mrs. Henderson brought 2 additional Red Cross volunteers, and we have direct communication with emergency services. The beauty of defending your own neighborhood is that every advantage belongs to the home team. The surveillance operatives knew building layouts and street patterns from their reconnaissance, but they didn't know that the seemingly random placement of garbage cans along Maple Street had been deliberately positioned to create funnel points. They didn't know that the community center's exterior lighting had been modified to eliminate blind spots around the perimeter. Most importantly, they didn't know that the quiet suburban residents they'd been observing for 3 days had spent the last 6 hours transforming into a coordinated defensive network. Movement update, Tom's voice reported. They've reached the edge of residential area, splitting into 2 teams, approaching from northwest and northeast vectors. Copy. Mrs. Patterson, activate Community Alert Protocol. Throughout Willowbrook Heights, porch lights began flickering in sequence, a prearranged signal that residents should secure their homes and avoid exterior exposure. To outside observers, it might look like random electrical fluctuations, but to everyone who'd received Janet's carefully distributed communication plan, it meant defensive operations were active. Doug, defensive positions report. Engineering stations Alpha through Delta are manned and ready. We have clear fields of observation covering all approach routes. The surveillance team's second tactical error was assuming that civilian resistance would be uncoordinated and ineffective. They were approaching residential targets using standard military infiltration techniques, but those techniques were designed for operations against unprepared populations, not communities that had spent hours establishing overlapping security zones. Contact imminent, Tom reported. Lead team is approaching house number 47. My house. They were moving toward my address with the confidence of operators who believed their intelligence was complete and their opposition was minimal. Time to demonstrate that both assumptions were incorrect. All stations, implement response protocol now. What happened next would have impressed any military tactician. Tom's patrol teams emerged from concealed positions with coordinated timing, using handheld spotlights to eliminate the operative's night vision advantage. Doug's defensive positions activated motion sensor lighting that turned the entire residential block into daylight visibility. Mrs. Patterson coordinated radio communication that flooded emergency frequencies with professional-quality tactical reporting. Most importantly, Marcus emerged from storm drain access points that allowed him to appear behind the surveillance team's position, demonstrating that local knowledge had given us tactical superiority despite their professional training. Federal agents, this is Willowbrook Heights Community Defense, I announced through the tactical megaphone Henderson had provided. You are surrounded by coordinated civilian resistance with police support and federal oversight en route. Withdraw immediately or face escalation. The response was immediate radio chatter in languages I recognized but couldn't fully understand. Professional operators communicating with command authority, requesting guidance about engagement rules when faced with organized civilian resistance. Henderson, what's your assessment? I asked through our secure channel.
They're withdrawing to fallback positions, professional discipline. They won't engage civilians without clear operational authority. The helicopter arrived 18 minutes later, followed by federal vehicles that established perimeter control around the entire neighborhood. By the time FBI tactical specialists had set up their command post, the surveillance team had disappeared as quietly as they had arrived, leaving behind only evidence of professional reconnaissance and the knowledge that their extraction mission had been completely neutralized. 3 hours later, as federal agents finished debriefing community members and documenting our defensive coordination, Chief Henderson gathered our neighborhood watch group in the community center one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced formally, "I want to thank you for demonstrating that community safety is best protected by community members who understand what they're protecting." Tom was studying the tactical reports with obvious pride. "General Foster, I have to ask, was this what real security operations feel like?" "Tom, this was better than most real security operations," I replied honestly. "Professional military units would have envied the coordination, local knowledge, and community commitment you demonstrated tonight." Janet looked up from her final logistics report. "So what happens now? Do you go back to being Sarah Collins?" I considered the question while looking around the room at people who'd proven they were capable of far more than anyone had imagined. Tom, who'd transformed from amateur security enthusiast to tactical coordinator. Janet, whose organizational skills had enabled complex operations under pressure. Mrs. Patterson, whose military spouse experience had provided communication expertise that federal agencies respected. Doug, whose weekend warrior knowledge had translated into effective defensive engineering. Marcus, whose community dedication had created the foundation for everything we had accomplished. Sarah Collins was always temporary, but General Catherine Foster doesn't have to be either. What matters is that Willowbrook Heights has proven it can protect itself when protection is necessary. Henderson stepped forward with official documentation. "The FBI has requested that General Catherine Foster remain available as a community security consultant for this area. Apparently, federal agencies are interested in studying how communities can maintain effective defensive capabilities." "Meaning?" Doug asked. "Meaning that your neighborhood watch program just became a model for community defense coordination, and your security consultant just became officially recognized by federal law enforcement." Tom grinned and extended his hand. "General Foster, on behalf of the Willowbrook Heights Neighborhood Watch, welcome to the team, officially this time." As I shook hands with each member of our group, I realized that hiding in plain sight had taught me something more valuable than operational security. It had shown me that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when they're protecting something that matters to them. Sarah Collins was the cover identity I needed to disappear. But General Catherine Foster, security consultant for Willowbrook Heights, was exactly who I'd always been meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.